Welcome to Daily Debrief by People's Dispatch. I'm Pragya and today we look at the fresh sanctions on Iran. We bring an update on the Ukraine war and we'll talk about the latest edition of the World Hunger Report. The United States has imposed fresh sanctions on Iran. These sanctions relate to oil trade between Iran and entities around the world. The Biden administration had said it would revive the Iran nuclear deal or JCPOA, which the United States had walked out of in 2018. But recent talks in Doha and Vienna have failed. The United States claims new conditions from Iran go beyond the original arrangement. Meanwhile, Iran's nuclear abilities have continued to strengthen. Abdul from People's Dispatch is here with us. Let's talk to him about these sanctions. Hi, Abdul. Abdul, so the sanctions and the round of talks that hasn't worked out, can you give us some context to what's going on?
Well, after the we can say that after the failure of the 8 rounds of talks in Vienna, it was almost it became very clear that the talks are not going further. But somehow the remaining parties of the JCPOA have revived the talks in Doha. The last week the talks were held, but of course it did not go beyond a certain point, primarily because the US claimed that Iranians have put new conditions which were not part of the original deal, which Iranians have denied, of course, refuted. Yet on that particular confusion, whether there is a kind of attempt to put new conditionalities or not, the talks have not progressed further. So though the Qatari foreign minister has visited Iran recently, yesterday he was there, and Iran is saying that it is willing to talk and it has not put anything new on the table. It is the part of the original deal. It seems that the talks will revive again. Meanwhile, the US going further on its claim that Iranians are not serious about reviving the deal, has imposed first rounds of sanctions on entities which are involved in oil trade between Iran and East Asian countries, primarily China, with the hope that this will pressurize Iranians to basically follow what US is trying to put through. That is the objective behind this fresh round of sanctions. These sanctions, that is ironically, the US, as you rightly pointed out, is hoping that this fresh round of sanctions will force Iranians to agree to its demands. I think that is a foolish step. We have seen that the sanctions which have been imposed since 2018 have not had much effect on the Iranians' will to negotiate. It is only basically Iranians' willingness to follow the JCPOA and other things that has created a possibility of Iranians willing to cooperate with the remaining signatories of the JCPOA, not the pressure created by the US. So right. That particular path which US is following, I think, has time again proven that is a wrong path, and it will not lead to any fruitful conclusion in this particular context.
Right, Abdul. There's also a repeated question which keeps coming up of Iran charting its own course in the nuclear arena. Is that what is likely to happen if these talks don't work out?
I think it is already happening. Even US acknowledges that. But Iranians have realized that US is working under not only its own ideological attempts to create the regional hegemony in West Asia and in the Middle East, it is also very much influenced by what Israel is trying to put forward as its interest, which is against the revival of the JCPOA. Since until Israel agrees for the revival, Iranians seems to think that this deal is not going to materialize, and they cannot wait till US and US and Israel sort out their differences on the revival of the deal. And meanwhile, it is of course enriching uranium, not only because it wants to prove to the world that it has the right to do so, also because it is required as a part, it is required as a sovereign nation in the region that it asserts its sovereignty, its independence. So these are the reasons that Iranians have been, you can say, the violating or going back to their commitments of the JCPO, not only in terms of enriching more uranium and keeping them into storage, but also trying to create their own independent regional policies, which US has tried to make it a part of the JCPO, as we all know, correct? So the entire politics around JCPO and the attempts to revive it has to be seen in that larger context in which Iranians have had the need to assert their independent foreign policy in the region vis-a-vis Syria or Yemen or Hezbollah and other players which are the allies. It also needs to basically assert its economic independence. So the JCPO and the sanctions imposed since the withdrawal imposed by the US since the withdrawal of in 2018 have created some kind of economic impact on Iranians, particularly during the COVID. Common Iranians had suffered a lot.
Right.
So they need to get rid of that kind of negative effects which sanctions have, and that is also part of the larger discussions and the negotiations which are happening around the nuclear deal.
All right, Abdul, thanks a lot for that update. A G20 foreign ministers meet is on in Indonesia's Bali with Russia's foreign minister Sergei Lavrov attending. The Russia-Ukraine conflict is likely to dominate many discussions as European and other Western nations take positions against the country. Meanwhile, China, South Africa and India, also attending the meeting, have not backed the sanctions on Russia, and they have found ways to continue trade and diplomatic ties as before the conflict. We have Prabir Purkaisa with us to discuss these developments. Prabir, hi. The G20 has been pretty divided on the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Is this sense of divide likely to continue?
At the moment, I don't think the rapprochement of any kind or some discussion on the sidelines by which certain maybe path towards peace can be worked out. I don't see any of that happening because I think the positions are still very, very hard as far as the NATO powers are concerned. And I'm going to talk about the NATO powers because they are all acting in concert. They would like this war to continue and weaken Russia. In fact, that's the stated aim. Biden has said it again and again. And in that sense, the Ukraine is willing to go with this in the belief that maybe what the NATO commanders are telling them, that Russia is about to fall apart, may be true. And therefore, they just have to hold out a little more. At the moment, these perceptions are so far apart from what Russia wants and what NATO wants, that and Ukrainians in the middle of this war, that I don't think there is any possibility at the moment of a rapprochement. The other part of it is also there's a China and a Pacific NATO, if you will, where the NATO plus the four countries over there, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, they are coming together in the United States to essentially be the eastern part of a NATO flank, so to say. And this is a qualitatively new development again. So I think there also the relationship between China and the United States, including the Taiwan issue, all of this is also going to be another sore spot in the G20 summit. So all of this, it seems, are going to need some more time before each side realizes what the possibilities are, in the middle of which, of course, we have a food crisis of an enormous dimension, you have an energy crisis of an enormous dimension, falling of the global economy as the various currencies seem to fall, including the euro and the Japanese yen, as also the rupee. And on top of that, you have the overarching climate crisis, which is going to take a huge hit, because now the European Union is saying we are back to coal.
Right.
So, so that's because we don't have enough gas, we don't have enough oil, so we might just rev up our coal burning. So this is a very dangerous situation for the world. I'm not even talking of the pandemic and other things, but the hunger, economic crisis, all of this have to be taken into account. It doesn't seem that G20 is going to address any of it, and that's the misfortune, that you have the foreign ministers, and yet none of these possibilities are going to actually take place.
Right, Prabir. Now, speaking of ferment, Europe is in ferment. We have governments falling, we have the economic crisis, which you just mentioned, and yet they have time for sanctions on Russia and to plan those out in great detail and repeatedly. Do you think this will continue?
At the moment, there doesn't seem to be, again, any going back on Europe's part on this. It's really the European Union and NATO which seem to have fused together, though they're not identical, but for all practical purposes, they have become identical. So they seem to be going that if we shore up Ukraine militarily and we continue with sanctions, this is going to weaken Russia, and that is the role they had started playing right from the beginning, when they refused to talk about the eastward march of NATO, which is what the Russians had put on the table. They refused to accept that the Minsk Accord 1 and 2 could be the basis of a Ukrainian solution. So all of that they rejected. So what they've got now is the war. I think the belief was that Russia would crumble, that militarily they would not be able to prevail and would not be able to fight a long war. And economically, what they call the nuclear sanctions, what Biden had said, reduce the Russian ruble to rubble.
Right.
And if their financials, the sanctions bit them that hard that the Russian economy would be close to a collapse within 2 to 3 months, then Russia would cry uncle, and then they could really, for once, break Russia as a major power in the world. So I think that seemed to have been the underlying assumption. And initially, for about 15 days or so, it looked like that was a possibility. But now, it's just the reverse of that, particularly for Europe, who has money, therefore can buy food. So unlike Africa and large parts of other parts of the world, like Asia as well as in Latin America, where this is an issue. Food may not be such a big issue for the European Union, but energy is. And at the moment, even countries like Germany, Italy, all of them are UK, they're all facing high electricity and gas and oil price. All of this is hitting the people hard. And without going into the details of why the gas price affects the electricity price so much, we can say that if the gas price goes up by 2 to 3 times, as it seems to have done in the recent past, because the ruble price ruble value going up, what happens is the price of electricity goes up even more. And if that happens, then of course people are hit with a whole lot of things depend on electricity. But Germany's industrialists and the workers both are saying this is a disaster for us. And chemical industry, which Germany is big, metallurgical industry, the automobile industry, all of this Germany are big players. Engineering industry, all of them, the German industrialists are saying, if this continues, we are going to shut down. We have no other option. There are huge protests taking place in different parts of Europe at the moment for different reasons, but all of it connected to either food or energy prices. So I have no idea why Europe is digging its own grave, because US, which is driving the sanctions, is not going to be hit that hard. It produces food and it produces oil and gas and even coal. So I'm really not understanding why Germany and other European countries want to commit harakiri, when at the moment they should be looking for peace and how to get out of the war.
Right, Prabir. Thanks a lot for that update. The state of food security and nutrition in the world, a report of the United Nations has said the world is slipping back on bringing hunger under control. At current levels of hunger, even if the global economy recovers, there will be 670 million hungry people in the world in 2030. That is the level of hunger in the world in 2015. The report has essentially warned that the world could lose all that it has achieved in the last nearly 1 decade in terms of eliminating hunger. It says up to 828 million people went hungry in 2021. That figure is 48 million higher than in 2020, the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic and before the conflict in Ukraine. We spoke to Anna from the People's Health Movement earlier today about the report and its warnings. Anna, can you just take us through the chief findings of the latest report on hunger? It paints a very alarming picture. Can you just tell us what the report actually says?
Yes, so that's very right. What this report does, it basically looks at different aspects of how food security and nutrition is working out in the world. And I think that two things are maybe mainly worth singling out. So the first one is, of course, the level of hunger and the burden of hunger that has fallen and continued to grow in the world since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so, the report looks at the numbers from 2021 for this aspect, and it shows that the number continues to grow. So in 2021, we have seen that a global total of about 820 million people were hungry. And that's an increase of more than 45 million compared to 2020. And I believe that it's around 150 million if we look at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. So, it really shows that since the pandemic has began, then we have seen that more and more people are going hungry, and it's of course having a direct effect on their life. Now, so the report, of course, it's a UN report, so it looks at the targets that the UN sets, and it approaches nutrition and food security by looking at the Sustainable Development Goals and if they're about to be achieved or not. And of course, unsurprisingly, considering the numbers, the report states that we are very far away from achieving what we wanted to achieve by 2030, and that was ending hunger and food insecurity and malnutrition in all its forms. So we should have made better food available for people, and we are nowhere near that. And so, we have spoken about hunger several times before, I think also because several reports came out looking at particular regions, especially in Africa, which has seen an unprecedented food crisis over the past few months. And so this report actually goes even further and looks a bit into the global numbers of this. And so, if we look at how the world population experienced hunger in 2021, we see that almost 10% of all people in the world went hungry last year, and even more so, 1/3 of the world population was food insecure in one way or another. So if we translate this into numbers, it's more than 2 billion people. It's a tremendous amount of people who did not have adequate access to food at some point. And then, there are, of course, the usual differences that we continue to underline in not only when it comes to food, but in health, in education. There's a notable gender gap. So, there's more women going hungry or facing food insecurity than men. And that's not only, it's, I believe, over 30% of women who have faced food insecurity in 2021 compared to 27 or 28% of men. And it's not just the difference, which would be alarming itself, but it's the fact that this difference is growing. So if we compare the difference, the gender gap between 2021 and 2020, we see that it has increased by 4%. So, we are seeing that all the things that are happening now are impacting women more than they are impacting men. And then, of course, finally, there are the regional differences. And that's, we know that 20% of people in Africa are going hungry. And this is more than 10% of the people who are hungry in Asia. That's 9%. And even more compared to what's happening in Europe and North America, where 2.5 people of the population are hungry. So, we see that the distribution of this hunger burden that the world is facing is so unevenly distributed. And we are also seeing that the countries which have shouldered most of the burden during the pandemic because they did not have access to adequate resources for financing their social systems, health systems, that they're also facing the highest percentages of hunger right now.
There's also the question that the UN also says that we are going back to the levels that we were at in 2015. Does that sound very alarming to you? Could things actually improve in the economy and then that sort of situation does not arise?
The feeling that the report actually shows is that it's unlikely that we are going to see a very notable improvement in this. So if there's not a major change in how the pandemic recovery is going to look and how countries' governments are going to be able to support the people throughout the following period, then we are not going to see any improvement in this. And of course, it's not only about the numbers, the amount of people that are going hungry. It's also, and the report is also underlining that it's also about how good of a quality of food the people have access to. So, and this is, I believe, the first time that the report goes into this aspect of the problem, as it compares, healthy diets have been a very popular topic for quite a bit of years now. But then on the other hand, we do know that healthy diets and healthy food, healthy nutritious food, remains inaccessible to many people because of the high price. And so the report looks at how feasible it looks. So if we compare people's income to the food prices, how many of them are likely to be able to access healthy and nutritious foods? And so this was not great for the period that the report looks at. And it's unlikely to become better in the next year or so, also because not only we know that there's the food prices are rising everywhere, but we also know that income is falling. So people will be able to purchase less and less food for the same amount of money. And in the world, we have already seen how bad the consequences of this situation can be. And that's because people are forced to resort to black market, to forego meals in order to be able to afford to feed their children, and so on and so on. So these are very alarming showing results that the report shows.
Right, Anna, thanks a lot for joining us, and it really is a very alarming picture. And that is all we have for you today. Thank you for watching Daily Debrief. We look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. Do keep watching us for more news and analysis, and follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram for updates from around the world.